And welcome to today's Vorys webinar. Thank you for participating in our discussion this afternoon entitled Sexual Harassment, What to Know and What to Do in the MeToo Era. Before we get started, please review your screen to be sure that you see the following items. Presentation slides on top, a Q&A box on the right, and 3 pods below, one for downloadable materials, one for related websites, and one for a request for CLE or SHRM credit. All pods can be accessed throughout the presentation without interruption to the program. We encourage you to click into these links and documents for additional insight. Please note that the participant phone lines have been muted and will be muted throughout the duration of the presentation. We also ask that you mute your own lines as well via the Mute My Phone button on the screen or directly on your phone. We hope to offer time for questions at the conclusion of the presentation, and at that time we'll open up the phone lines. You may also type your questions in the private Q&A box throughout the presentation. And now for opening remarks and introductions, I would like to turn the call over to Jackie Ford, partner with Vorys, Sater, Seymour MPs.
Thank you, Kayla, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here with my colleague, Alex Bluebond.
Hello, everyone.
And we'll be talking today about the MeToo movement, both in terms of its legal ramifications and implications, and the practical real-world aspects and what our partners in the HR world can be doing to help us navigate these dangerous waters. I know that a great many of you who are with us today on the webinar are HR professionals and not necessarily lawyers. So we're going to try to provide you with a balance of legal advice and practical HR advice for how to deal with the MeToo issues that are presenting themselves. So here's sort of an overview of where we want to go today. First of all, we want to be informative. So Alex in a moment is going to take us through a discussion of what is the MeToo movement. We've all seen this hashtag, we've seen stories in the media, but what is the MeToo movement that we're talking about here, and what do we need to understand about its contours? Then we want to talk about both the proactive and the reactive aspects of helping your organizations reduce their exposure to these types of sexual harassment claims. On the proactive side, what steps can you be taking now to reduce the likelihood of harassment occurring? Because obviously the best way to reduce your exposure for harassment claims is to reduce the possibility that you'll actually have harassment occurring at your workplaces. And then on the reactive side, what if the worst happens? That you get allegations that sexual harassment has occurred at your organization at any level, particularly if it comes with the kind of publicity or potential for publicity that the MeToo cases have typically brought. So what is the reactive piece? What are some of the best steps you can be preparing for in the event you get caught in those crosshairs? And then both before and after, there's a real danger here, I think, of backlash and gender discrimination coming from responses to the MeToo movement itself. It's anecdotal so far, but I'm hearing from HR professionals, and we're seeing reported in various places, some backlash to that effect, either because the MeToo movement itself is perceived, and I've seen this term more than once, perceived as a witch hunt of some sort, which I think is an interesting term to use. But the sense that, that's sort of a fast-moving current, and that there's some fear of that and some backlash from it. So we're going to talk about that as well. So our overall topics for today, first of all, MeToo is more than a hashtag. And as I said, Alex will take us through some of that. Some strategies for prevention. A note about a tension in the law between the EEOC's guidance on preventing harassment and what the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, has been saying in recent years about efforts to encourage civility at work. You'd think every federal agency would think that, that civility would be a good thing, but that's not always true over at the NLRB. And then I want to take a moment to talk about the problem of toxic superstars. And that's a term we're using for senior people who are producing good revenue for your company and are considered successful, important, key components of your leadership, but unfortunately have toxic work habits, including harassing people. And what happens when you try to bring consequences for the toxic superstar in a harassment situation? Because these MeToo claims often come with a very quick fuse, a very quick timeline to process an allegation, respond to it, investigate it, make decisions about it. Quick and accurate investigations are more important than ever. And being prepared, having the pieces in place to pull that kind of investigation together is another thing you can be doing now to prepare yourself and your organization. And then finally, as I said before, talking about the danger of backlash and some things that you can be doing, hopefully, to prevent or reduce the impact of any kind of backlash of that sort. So that's the overview of where we're headed for today. Now, Alex is going to take us through the MeToo movement itself.
All right. So as you know, as Jackie said, we've all seen this hashtag MeToo, and I think it's a little bit unclear of where it comes from or what it is. And so that's what I'm going to be talking a little about here. I don't think most people know that the term Me Too was actually first used in relation to sexual harassment and sexual assault by a civil rights activist in 2006 named Tarana Burke. But it sort of took off more recently with this tweet that's on the screen there by Alyssa Milano. It says, if you've ever been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet. And well, it took off really fast. I mean, the next morning after she tweeted this in October of 2017, she had 55,000 replies. Me Too was the #1 trending hashtag on Twitter, and it's only grown exponentially since that. I mean, everything that you've seen about Me Too on social media and the media recently has only come since October 2017. So think about how much you've heard, how recently. And in fact, it was actually part of Time's Person of the Year. And I think that one of the reasons why that's so interesting is that as we talk about what the Me Too movement, what does it mean that something's a movement? There's not really a central figure or organization setting an agenda. Time magazine named the Silence Breakers as the Person of the Year. There wasn't a single person that they identified as being the person who's responsible for this. It was everyone. And so how do we really classify this? I mean, the term that I'm using is decentralized collective action, to kind of say that it's a lot of people kind of working towards in the same direction, but there's no central figure or organization directing it. It's kind of hard to say what the goals of hashtag MeToo are as a result of this decentralized collective action. Is it to raise awareness, to empower victims to speak out, challenge social norms, or change the law? I mean, I think it's different for different people who participate in the movement. So I think when we're talking about hashtag MeToo, it's easier to talk in terms of the results and consequences that we have from this hashtag movement. And we see that hashtag MeToo casts a very wide net. The press coverage about what falls under hashtag MeToo is everything from inappropriate language to bullying to physical assault. And I think you'd see that some people don't think it should all be included in that hashtag, whereas other people think that, no, the hashtag should be fully encompassing of everything to give a broad picture of what's going on. Many of the highly publicized cases, this is in terms of the consequences and results, have been from people who have had multiple allegations against them. It's not just one accuser. Often we'll see that it's 9, 30, 60 in case of some people. And it results in large payouts to the accusers from the accused and from their employers. And then also, people are forced to resign as a result of these, or as you'll see here, all kinds of things happen as a result of this. I think the most famous example right now is Harvey Weinstein, who had more than 90 women in the film industry accuse him of sexual misconduct over the last 30 years, and some of his were pretty severe, and then he was forced to resign from the Weinstein Company and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. I won't go through all of these. I imagine you've seen most of these, but just, some of the other highlights are that, it happens with men coming forward. Kevin Spacey was accused by 9 men, and he was removed from his show House of Cards, and then his scenes were actually cut from a movie he had already filmed. The film was All the Money in the World, and they were refilmed with another actor because he was considered so toxic. Al Franken and Roy Moore in the realm of politics. A face that you might not recognize in the top right is Alex Kaczynski. He was actually one of the most prominent Court of Appeals judges in the United States, and he resigned late last year as a result of some allegations from his clerks and other people that worked with him showing that he inappropriately touched or kissed them and showed them pornography in the workplace. So this is all over the place, including judges. So these two, I think, are worth talking about because they actually occurred right before the hashtag MeToo started, which was again in October of last year. Bill Riley, in April of 2017, the New York Times reported that O'Reilly and Fox News had settled 6 lawsuits, sexual harassment lawsuits dating back to 2002, and altogether those settlements came to around $45 million. Fox News shortly thereafter announced that Bill Riley would not return to the network. One of those settlements alone was for $32 million, just the sixth one, the last one. And you have to wonder what happened in that case. How bad was it that that alone was $32 million? And the other Fox News person that in July of 2017, again before hashtag MeToo, Roger Ailes was forced to resign. He was the head of Fox News. Allegations were made by 6 women, including Fox News hosts Gretchen Carlson and Megyn Kelly, and those 6 settlements that he had came to around $45 million again. And then on top of both of the $90 million that they had for these 2 settlements, earlier this year, 21st Century Fox settled a separate shareholder derivative action for $90 million related to the company's mismanagement of these sexual harassment claims. So this has been very expensive for Fox News and 21st Century Fox. And here's another very interesting, I guess, situation that has happened as a result of, I would say as a result of hashtag MeToo. Hillary Clinton, earlier this year in January, New York Times reported that she decided not to fire one of her staffers that was accused of harassment during her first presidential campaign all the way back in 2008. So just to think this is about something she did 10 years ago. That employee then, first, the allegations against that employee were that were by 2 people. The first one said that he had commented on her looks and engaged in constant touching. The second one said that on one occasion, this person had kissed her on the tip of her nose at the end of an evening. So that's what the allegations were. So relatively minor compared to some of the other allegations that we've seen. And and Hillary Clinton docked that person's pay, required him to go to counseling, but did not fire this person. That employee then went on to be employed by a Democratic super PAC fund, which is fundraising for campaigns, and then he was again accused of harassment. Hillary Clinton, after this report came out, she said that she would do it differently now. She would not have done that. And so for multiple reasons, I think that this case just seems very interesting. And I'll let you draw your own conclusions as to why. But the fact that this was something that happened 10 years ago where the allegations were relatively minor and there was some degree of punishment, but even that is forcing some sort of public reaction from the person who's accused of handling the situation.
And I would say, too, Alex, I think one of the other interesting points about that is that in 2008, if you or I had been advising an employer that had allegations of that sort, and they had said, hey, how about docking his pay and sending him for counseling, and then maybe, monitoring for some follow-up, does that sound sufficient? We might very well have said yes. Yeah,
that would have been, I think, a pretty reasonable reaction. And now I think everyone is looking at these situations a little differently. The next one that we have is one that we're seeing more in the realm of in the business environment, related to Steve Wynn, who is the CEO and founder of Wynn Resorts. He was accused by multiple employees of Wynn Resorts of pressuring them into performing sexual acts, and they stated they feared losing their jobs if they didn't do it. And immediately when that came out, Wynn Resort stock dropped 10%. The board of directors formed a committee to investigate Steve Wynn. Wynn pretty quickly resigned from his position as a fundraiser at the RNC, but then just last night around 10 p.m., Wynn resigned from Wynn Resorts. So we'll see if the name changes. But that just shows you how quickly these things are updating. We didn't even have a chance to update this slide to include the fact that he resigned from his company. But I think that it's also interesting to note that right before this presentation started, I checked the stock of Wynn Resorts, and it was up 8.5% after his resignation yesterday. So that might tell you something about how people are perceiving the reaction to getting rid of some of these, we'll say, toxic superstars, which Jackie will talk about later. And here's another movement. I guess this one is somewhat different from hashtag #MeToo. It's hashtag Time's Up. And it's different because this one is more organized. There's a legal entity that they've registered in the state of California called Time's Up Group LLC. They've trademarked this Time's Up logo. And there's a website that you can visit and see sort of their message and their the things that they want to accomplish, their goals, which we said with hashtag #MeToo is kind of a hard thing to figure out. The purpose of hashtag Time's Up is to support people who have less access to media platforms or funds to speak up. I mean, I think that you saw with hashtag #MeToo, a lot of those people were famous and being accused by actors or people in the news industry or other media. But this one is supposed to be more about people who can't just go to the media, who the media is not always going to talk to. So they started a legal defense fund for women seeking justice for sexual harassment and assault in the workplace. And the legal defense fund is administered by the National Women's Law Center. The website, by the way, is www.timesupnow.com if you wanted to check that out yourself. But in many ways, this is different from hashtag #MeToo because it has an organization behind it, identifiable goals and initiatives that it's taking. They're also advocating for legislation to punish companies that tolerate persistent harassment. It's not entirely clear what legislation they're going to be pushing. Some people have mentioned in interviews that they would like to get rid of confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements and sexual harassment settlements, but you can't find that on their website yet. I think one thing to note after all of this is so far the law hasn't changed. The Title VII and state laws have prohibited sexual harassment in the workplace for a long time now. And so far the law is the same. But the change that we've really seen is the result of outrage being channeled into the media and social media to apply pressures to companies. It forces quick resolutions and sometimes big payouts without lawsuits. So I think the question that everyone can ask themselves about this is, what is the result of that? What are the consequences of all these quick resolutions without lawsuits? Does that result in a lack of due process for the accused? Does it reflect a need for quicker resolutions than courts can offer? Is it both? I mean, I think those are tough questions that I think everyone surrounding this is kind of thinking where this is going to go.
And I think that for us as lawyers in particular, to see something with this much legal exposure that is essentially proceeding as an extrajudicial kind of process that skips over the EEOC, skips over the courts, and goes effectively straight to settlement negotiations, very speedy settlement negotiations, really kind of ups the stakes and changes some of that landscape.
Absolutely. I mean, from a lawyer's perspective, we think the EEOC was put in place for a reason to kind of administer these processes, and now they're a lot of times just not involved, and same with the courts, not involved in the way this happens. One law that has changed is the federal tax law, surprisingly enough. At the end of last year, when Congress passed the new tax bill, there was a provision in there related to sexual harassment settlements. And that bill, I think the way it was intended to be written, was it was to eliminate business deductions for the settlement of sexual harassment cases that involved confidentiality agreements, and also for the same type of settlements, attorney's fees related to in those cases. And so businesses would no longer be able to deduct those costs. But if you remember that when that tax bill was being passed, it was kind of hurried through Congress, and the language in this particular provision as a result, I think, is a little unclear, because it might also eliminate the deduction that victims can make for what they receive from sexual harassment settlements. And the bill, so to get a little technical, the bill amends Section 162 of the Act, which applies to business deductions, but the actual language states no deduction shall be allowed under this chapter. And that chapter covers both the business deduction and the deduction that the victims would make. So how is this going to play out? I don't think that's really clear, but we just want to bring this particular one to your attention because it is something that we've seen as a result of all of this. And now I'm going to pass it back to Jackie here to talk a little bit about how MeToo is new, but we've seen this stuff before.
Absolutely. As we all know, sexual harassment is certainly not a new problem. It seems to have a new emphasis and a new spotlight, but it is absolutely not a new problem, and it is absolutely not an uncommon problem. According to the EEOC, about 1/3 of all the complaints it does receive in a year for people who do use the EEOC process, of all the different topics that they deal with, about 1/3 of all the charges that are filed include some allegation of sexual harassment. So that means we have tens of thousands of EEOC charges being filed every year. The EEOC estimates that despite that high rate of charges being filed, that 75% of all workplace harassment never gets reported at all. It doesn't get reported internally. It doesn't get reported to the EEOC. It doesn't become a component in a lawsuit. So what we are seeing publicly is probably worst cases right now, but only a small fraction of cases. The EEOC's 2006 study estimated that at least 25% of working women experience sexual harassment at some point in their lives. Now, two comments on that. One, we are emphasizing primarily in our discussion today and in a lot of the Me Too, we are talking about the sort of traditional, if you will, paradigm of women alleging harassment by men. Clearly, any form of sexual harassment, regardless of the genders of the individuals involved, is equally prohibited by law. But we're focusing for the moment on the current topical focus, which is women alleging sexual harassment by men. And when the EEOC says at least 25%, the studies are producing very widely diverging results. It's anywhere from 25% to 80% of women who experience some sort of sexual harassment, depending, of course, on how you define that term. But clearly, it is not an uncommon phenomenon. And the law on this is not new either. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, and specifically Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, has been on the books for over 40 years. The Civil Rights Act prohibits sex discrimination. It does not define the term sex, and in fact, the word sex was added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as an effort to defeat the bill, which is part of the explanation for why our law in this area is so confused. When the Civil Rights Act was being passed in 1964, as you might imagine, the primary purpose was to eliminate racial discrimination, which was a focus of civil rights efforts at that time. And a group of senators attempting to defeat that bill thought if they added sex to race, color, religion, and national origin as a protected category, they might be able to slow things down and stall that bill being voted on and being passed. But it didn't work. And the bill passed anyway, and without any congressional testimony or definitions, we now had a law against sex discrimination, and nobody really knew what that meant. So the case law proceeded until 1979 when the Meritor Savings Bank versus Vinson case was decided by the Supreme Court, in which it basically accepted the EEOC's definition of sexual harassment and said, yes, sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination covered by the Civil Rights Act. So that is how sexual harassment becomes something illegal under federal law. Now, most of you know, whether you're lawyers or not, who are with us today, you probably know that sexual harassment breaks down into two general categories. One is called quid pro quo, and one is called hostile environment. The quid pro quo case, as the name suggests, is one where sexual behavior is the currency of the workplace. Sexual behavior is exchanged for workplace benefits that the harasser has the ability to give and take away. So that might be raises, it might be promotions, it might be hiring, it might be any number of things. But by definition, that requires a manager or supervisor, right, to be involved in that, because only a manager or supervisor can give and take away those benefits. What's considerably more difficult to define is the hostile environment category, which can involve any combination of employees and even the influence of customers and vendors and other people who come into the work environment. But what's important to remember here that I think often trips people up when they're investigating allegations of sexual harassment, the question is not whether the behavior was voluntary on the part of the complaining employee, and again, using the paradigm of a woman alleging harassment by a man. It's not did she voluntarily laugh along with the inappropriate jokes? Did she voluntarily participate in behavior at work? The question is not voluntary. The question is whether it was welcome or unwelcome. And that comes from the EEOC test and the Supreme Court test. So as you're investigating these kinds of matters, it's important to remember that even a consensual, and we put that in quotations here, but even a consensual sexual relationship could be unwelcome and prohibited by law, particularly if it involves coercion of an employee by a supervisor or manager. So with all of that in mind, the Supreme Court took up a pair of cases in 1998 that we refer to as the Farragher and Ehlers cases. And in those cases, the Supreme Court gave us as employers a tremendous incentive to do the right thing to prevent harassment and to try to fix things afterwards. And again, we're talking here about hostile environment cases specifically. In the quid pro quo case, you have far fewer defenses, far fewer. But in a hostile environment case, there is a tremendous legal incentive to do what most of us, I think, in the HR world would want to do anyway, which is prevent it and keep it from happening again. So the court said in the Farragher and Ehlers cases that an employer has an affirmative defense, which, again, for the non-lawyers means a full defense, a 100% defense, even if hostile environment harassment has occurred. If you have done two things. One is take steps involving reasonable care to prevent harassment from occurring. And then in response to it, what was your reactive step? Did you take swift and remedial measures reasonably calculated to keep it from happening again? And as you heard from Alex's review of the MeToo cases, right now, the reasonably calculated steps nearly always amount to firing the individual. And the behavior alleged in those cases is very severe. But there are cases where the behavior is less severe, and the question is, what is a swift and remedial response? But those cases have given us that structure. And the preventive measures, as we learned in the Kolstad case from the Supreme Court in 1999, an important part of that is training and policy development and doing those in meaningful ways. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So in June of 2016, the EEOC began looking at this issue again before the MeToo hashtag really emerged and put out an extensive report on this subject. And I thought this paragraph from it really sums up a lot of the questions that I think we as lawyers and many of our HR friends are asking right now. With legal liability long ago established, with reputational harm from harassment well known, with an entire cottage industry of workplace compliance and training adopted and encouraged for 30 years, why does so much harassment persist and take place in so many of our workplaces? Is there something we've been missing? And I think there are indicators that there are numerous things we've been missing. The EEOC's own report goes on to focus on 4 major areas, and I think this is actually a pretty good summary of areas for us to focus on when we're thinking about preventive measures, not only because it's always good to rely on the agency that regulates you, but also because I do think they get to some of the heart of the matter. And those 4 categories are leadership, which has to do with setting the tone from the top of an organization, training, which absolutely has to improve. There's an awful lot of bad training out there, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the training has to improve and specifically also needs to include what we call bystander training, which is the idea that you want to train people not only to report their own issues, but to come forward if they see or learn of another employee being subjected to harassment. The third element is engagement, using sort of it's-on-us style campaigns, again, to bring people in from that collective perspective like the bystander training does, to gain employee engagement in both harassment prevention and reporting. And finally, this accountability aspect. You can have all the policies and training you want, but if harassing employees are not held to account, and if your employees can see that, they will learn not only that it is pointless for them to come forward, but what you allow, you teach. And when employees see that happening, it actually creates an environment that suggests a tone that the company has no objection to harassing behavior. Let's talk about that first component first, the leadership component. The idea is that company leadership has to take an active role in announcing and endorsing standards and expectations. Now, we always like to say we like to have leadership of the company, take an active role whenever you're passing a policy, but it's particularly important in this area. The research shows that, not surprisingly, employees know how companies demonstrate that they actually care about something. They're not just doing it to please the compliance department. So when they see a company using time and money, so a CEO's time or time taken up that would otherwise be spent generating revenue, employees know that time and money means a commitment to something. And when a leader shows and demonstrates that time-money component, that's an effective part of an anti-harassment campaign. And accountability measures also have to be endorsed and followed by leadership. And again, we're going to talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. On the training side, and this is a really important message, I think, in the area of training, do it right or don't do it at all. Many sexual harassment training programs are poorly done, and probably many folks listening to our discussion today are nodding their heads. You've seen the off-the-shelf product that uses cartoonish examples or requires your employees to do 5 minutes of clicking through on a computer screen. That type of training is worse than ineffective. There are actually a number of studies showing that bad training sometimes ends up, again, because it uses these really extreme examples, it ends up being perceived as just male bashing and can actually worsen workplace behavior. So not only does it not make it better, it actively makes it worse. And there are several studies of this. We've noted one here. There's a 2001 study, I think it's from Berkeley, of training for university faculty. So they had one group of university faculty who went through training and another group that did not. And when they studied them later, they found that those who had been through the training actually had an adverse reaction to it that made them more likely to be hostile to their female colleagues. Again, other studies have found that when the behavior focuses on scaring people, like Wednesday Addams, be afraid, be very afraid. A lot of training does that. Don't do this or you'll get sued. Don't do this, they're coming for you with the pitchforks. Again, that put the fear of God in people approach is understandable at one level, but it also tends to have a retreat reaction. And again, other studies have found specifically that for training that focuses on scaring people, the people who go through the training are not only less likely to harass, they are more likely to discriminate and harass because they are more likely to view female coworkers with suspicion. We're going to talk about this backlash issue a little bit later, but you see it in things like men saying, who have been through this kind of training, saying, gosh, I guess I need to be afraid of all the women around me, so I'm not going to mentor women colleagues for fear of being accused of something. I'm not going to ever meet one-on-one with my female subordinates because even though I do that with my male subordinates, that's an important way of teaching and coaching and mentoring, I'm not going to do that. And anecdotally, we are starting to hear more of that. So again, if you're going to do the training, you need to do it well. So to be effective, again, this is based on the EEOC's review of the literature and what we've looked at ourselves. To be effective, training has to be specific to the particular workplace. So off-the-shelf products are unlikely to be effective. It has to feel like the real world. Again, not these over-the-top, loathsome examples, but things that acknowledge that sometimes there's some gray area.
Right. I mean, as much as, the ones we see in the news, like Harvey Weinstein, are cartoonish at times, it's not the most common way that harassment comes about. And so that's the example you use to teach people, then that's what you're going to get these results.
Exactly, because I'm fairly certain that the vast majority of your employees know that the Harvey Weinstein assaultive behavior is not appropriate and illegal. So if that's what you focus on in the training, you may be actually counterproductive. It has to look and feel like something the company cares about. So if you do other training programs that have the company logo on them and are introduced by a company leader, then this should too. It shouldn't feel like an afterthought. And consider training that focuses more on acceptable, not acceptable than legal, illegal. Now, as lawyers, of course, we love to talk about legal and illegal, but if all you're teaching people is how to stay one step ahead of the law, you're unlikely to be creating the kind of overall culture that is unlikely to result in harassment or is likely to encourage a greater level of civility.
The employees are likely to see it as something the company is doing because they have to, if you're talking about legal and illegal. But if it's what's acceptable and not acceptable, those are company standards. And so it makes it seem like it's to employees like something that the company really cares about.
Exactly. So, of course, we as lawyers always include some of the law to make sure we're grounded in that. But fundamentally, it has to be a much broader question. The other thing that needs to improve, I think, in a lot of organizations is accountability. So we can do policies, and we can do training, and we can make sure that we have multiple methods of reporting, which is critical, but all of that will be useless if your employees know or believe that violators will go unpunished. And I think this is especially true in what we refer to as toxic superstars. So the toxic worker is someone who is talented and productive, but who engages in behavior that's harmful to an organization. That's the kind of overall definition of that term. And we've all seen these. At the executive level, at a lower level, we've all seen it. When the toxic worker is also someone who generates substantial revenue or is otherwise highly valued, bad behavior is often allowed to continue, and we've probably all seen this at one point or another, that there's a slap on the wrist for the high-producing head of a division or head of a company when, in fact, the behavior is very serious. The result of that, and again, the literature is pretty clear on this, that the toxic superstar's own behavior gets worse, but it also brings other costs, including those of employee morale, and, of course, the risk that legal claims will come out of it. The characteristics of the toxic person, whether they're a superstar or not, they tend to have a rules don't apply to me or I'm above the law kind of attitude. Sometimes there's a very thin line between that and the kind of creative, innovative thinking you want, right, in a senior leader, but that can obviously get out of hand. So it's that rules don't apply attitude, a tendency to take credit for the work and accomplishments of others, quick to blame others rather than take personal responsibility, tendency to bully, and behavior that may escalate. Bullying is described by some folks as the sort of gateway drug to sexual harassment. They don't always go together, but some of the worst harassment comes as an outgrowth of another kind of bullying. And a lot of times, employees who are subjected to bad behavior including harassment by superstars, are afraid to report it because he's a superstar. And they, again, think there will be no accountability. And if I report and there's no accountability, it's superstar 1, me 0, or negative 1, because invariably it will come out that I made that report, and now I'm still in my same role with that same person. So the toxic behavior then continues unabated, and the harassment increases, and you can see where this model is headed. There was a really interesting study done in 2015, published in the Harvard Business Review, that employing or continue to employ the toxic worker often costs more than firing him. You'll hear the business people say, hey, I'm sorry, we can't do anything about Joe because, gosh, he's bringing in so much revenue. And in fact, sometimes the math of that is wrong. Because if Joe is a toxic superstar, yes, he's bringing in revenue, but he's generating costs as well. So you're having difficulty attracting and retaining top talent. Absenteeism and other performance issues fester. There's general inefficiency, poor morale, and again, legal exposure. So I would encourage all of you in HR, when you encounter this kind of situation, the pushback for severe consequences for a superstar, really take a look at the math and really try to think about that and coach to the idea that the superstar may be costing you more as an employee than he would be if you exited him.
Okay, so now one of the third prong the EEOC recommended, and that we're recommending as well, is engagement. And some of this is training, but this goes beyond training. This has a lot to do with the workplace culture that you build outside of that time when they have to sit down and be trained. The phrase we use is, it's on us. It encourages employees to report their own concerns and from what they see around them, that it's all of our responsibility, that it's the company's responsibility, it's the employee's responsibility to report when something goes wrong and to make sure that the environment is free from harassment. It shouldn't be left to just the person who's experiencing harassment to report it and to complain. It needs to be something that we all feel responsible for, from the top of the company all the way down. One way in which we can do that is have a meaningful open door policy, and by meaningful we don't mean just slap one in your employee handbook and make sure that you have the words open door somewhere so you can point to it when you get sued. The point here is to make sure that people actually use it. So you want to make sure that it provides multiple avenues for reporting, the supervisor, HR, or someone else if that's who you want them to go to. Typically we see supervisor and HR as the two places to go. But that way, if they don't feel comfortable going to one person or the other, they have a different person that they can go to. Another option that we like to encourage people to do is consider a hotline that allows anonymous reporting, because if someone doesn't have to feel like, oh, am I going to get blamed for this, then they are more likely to come forward. And by which I don't mean get blamed for the harassment, I mean get blamed for reporting. And so any avenue that allows people to make people more likely to come forward is a way that you can have encourage this "it's on us" culture at your workplace. Because the goal here is not to just kind of bury claims and keep it out of the news. It's to make sure it doesn't happen, and that happens when everyone at the company is on board. So another way in which you can build some engagement with that is civility policies, and this is something that the EEOC recommends. But civility policies and by civility policies we mean policies that say something like, we encourage people to be civil and respectful in the workplace and to treat everyone else in a civil and respectful manner. The EEOC promotes this. The NLRB doesn't. The NLRB is worried that civility policies are overbroad threats to workers' rights to engage in protected concerted activity, which is the buzzword for when complaining about your workplace to make things better, complaining about the terms and conditions of your employment. And so the NLRB was worried that if you're requiring people to be civil and respectful, that they won't complain about things that are wrong in the workplace. And so they've even gone as far as to strike down policies and say that have the words that require people to be respectful. And I mean, I think we're seeing a little bit of backtracking on that now. In December of 2017, the NLRB came up with a new standard for workplace policies that's more of a balancing test about how important is the thing you're trying to prevent or encourage versus what is the likelihood that it will actually discourage protective concerted activity. But we're still seeing where that goes. That test is very new, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think one of the important things to think about for what you're going to do is, what would you rather defend? Would you rather defend a lawsuit in which you are accused of being too civil and too respectful, or one in which you fail to take reasonable measures to encourage appropriate behavior? And I think most of us would rather be the one defending a lawsuit that says we're too respectful, too civil than the other one. And that's just the situation we're in right now. And maybe we'll see something different down the line, but that's the choice we're making at the moment.
I think we know where pretty much everybody would probably come out on that one, and hopefully that tension gets resolved as the NLRB continues to look at that issue. So what about when MeToo comes to your door and MeToo becomes you too, and you now have an allegation, perhaps something with the potential for publicity or other high profile? As we've said, these issues can arise very quickly, even though the allegations themselves may be years old. And we're not going to get into a discussion of it, but again, from a legal point of view, many of these claims are way beyond the applicable statute of limitations. And yet the leverage is not the actual legal claim. The leverage is, this happened, it shouldn't have happened, it's appalling behavior, and the company should make it right. And there's, of course, the threat of reputational harm from publicity and so on. But so this happens even in cases where the lawsuit that might have been filed is no longer viable. But regardless of those circumstances, you're going to want to investigate, and you're going to need to be prepared to do an investigation that is both speedy and accurate. And I know, again, there's been a lot of concern that, maybe the MeToo movement has sometimes been too quick to pass judgment. Alex mentioned this earlier, this idea that there has been a lack of due process. Most of the high publicity cases that I've seen and followed, there doesn't seem to be a great deal of dispute about the behavior. There may be a dispute about whether the punishment fits the crime, but for most of these, the facts or a central core of the facts have been demonstrated to be true. But that's not always the case, again, particularly when you have something that's going back with some history. And I gather I'm supposed to tell you, by the way, at this point, that this is your webinar code, Wednesday 07. So if you're seeking CLE credit, you need to make a note of this code, Wednesday 07, so that you can get CLE credit for the presentation. With that diversion, let's get back to why we do our investigations. And there are two major reasons that you investigate these allegations when they come forward. One is that the allegations may be true, and the other is that the allegations may be false. So you need to enter into the investigation with both of those as equal possibilities and try to bring some objectivity to the process. You will not be helping your organization if you prejudge the outcome. So some investigation tips, and we have lots more we could talk about with investigations, but we just want to give you the highlights today. Decide at the outset the who, what, when, why. Who should do this investigation? Should it be internal, or is this something where, for reasons of conflict or internal politics or what have you, I might want to have an objective outside investigator? Do I want it to be privileged? We as lawyers almost always say, well, of course you want it to be privileged. There are some times when you might not necessarily want it to be, and that, again, is a complex set of questions. Are you confident that it will be unbiased? And if not, what are the things you can do to correct that bias at the outset? And is there a single point person that you can put in as being responsible for this investigation? What you don't want are emails on which 17 people are copied and lots of information is being shared beyond a strict need to know. So if you have that one point person, tip of the spear, so to speak, that's going to be a better strategy for you. Make sure you define what are you investigating. What is the specific set of allegations that you need to be reviewing, and how quickly can it be done? There is this tremendous time pressure on these investigations, but it would be better to be done right than to be done fast. So both of those things are going to be pressures on you. The more that you can have an investigative team ready to go or have people in your organization trained in how to do investigations, the better positioned you will be. Decide at the outset whether you think this investigation is something that might be publicly discussed later. So for example, and we talked a little earlier about the sexual harassment case law that says you have an affirmative defense, 100% defense, if you do an effective investigation. Well, if that's the case, you may not necessarily want it to be privileged. And I see we had a question about privilege, just so everybody understands what we mean. We mean subject to the attorney-client privilege, either because the work is being done by counsel or it's being done at the direction of counsel for the purpose of addressing and reducing the company's exposure to legal claims. It's a very complex analysis, but again, this is one of the few areas where we sometimes step back and say there may be a reason that the investigation, even if it's conducted by counsel, might not in the end be something that's privileged. But that's a topic we can get into in more detail. Here's an example, too, of remembering one of the other legal risks that comes in investigations, which has to do with defamation. It is very easy to talk about claims before they have actually been verified. And when that happens, you risk defaming someone. This defamation, the basic legal definition of that is a false statement that is harmful to an individual's reputation that doesn't fall within one of the exceptions that allows you to explore those things. So here's an example from Penn State, and Penn State is the whole Jerry Sandusky series of events at Penn State actually highlights a number of learning points about investigation. But the particular one we wanted to talk about today has to do with making uninformed public statements. In 2011, a former coach at Penn State, Mike McQueary, stated publicly and stated to a grand jury that the athletic director, Tim Curley, and a vice president, Gary Schultz, had both failed to act on a report of sexual abuse that McQueary had made to them some years earlier involving Jerry Sandusky. Sandusky was later found to have abused a large number of children. Well, when that testimony was made, the Penn State president at the time, Grant Spanier, issued a statement supporting Curley and Schultz and said they had not known of the abuse and done nothing. So basically took their word and essentially was saying that McQueary was making false statements. Well, McQueary said, look, you've just defamed me because you've said that I lied to a grand jury. And certain types of statements, including ones that accuse somebody of a crime, are what we call defamation per se. So by saying publicly that I lied about that, when you really don't know one way or the other, by the way, that's the key thing. That's a false statement about me, and I'm going to sue you for defamation, and that is what happened. A jury agreed with McQueary and awarded him $1.15 million in damages for his defamation claim. So again, we all have to be able to discuss our theories and beliefs and questions of credibility in the course of an investigation. That's different than making a public statement about them. So be very careful about that. There's, I think, tremendous pressure in these MeToo episodes to come out and say, oh, we abhor what our executive did. Well, you may not know yet whether those allegations are true or false. Does every wrongdoer need to be fired? Legally, no. The test, as we said earlier, for hostile environment sexual harassment is to take steps reasonably calculated to keep it from happening again. But in the current environment, sometimes taking a step short of firing is seen as somehow being an apologist for terrible behavior, which can create its own backlash. Or here, the law of unintended consequences knocking over these pillars. As we noted, there is a potential for backlash in a number of ways. We've seen it, and we talked about it earlier in terms of bad training, and we're now seeing some of this witch hunt concept around Me Too producing a sense of backlash as well. That evidence is anecdotal, but we're seeing it reported now in the popular press as well as the legal press, this concern that we really are seeing this kind of a backlash from people. Some of it, again, is hiring fewer women. Gee, if I could avoid harassment cases by women if I just hired fewer women. And I had an executive I know just personally tell me something very similar recently about a position that was going to be filled, and one of the candidates was a perfectly well-qualified young woman, and he said, I know the team this person would be working with, and I think that given their language and behavior, I don't think she'd be a good fit there, and she might sue us, so I'm going to hire the male candidate instead. So unfortunately, that kind of straight-up sex discrimination is still occurring. Another one I mentioned earlier, refusing to meet with women alone or with the door shut. This last one, and I'm calling it the Mike Pence rule just because he's talked about it so openly, male executives having lunch or dinner with male colleagues one-on-one, but refusing to do that with women, thinking that it's somehow socially inappropriate to invite a woman to lunch even if she's on your team at the office. Unfortunately, that can lead to a lack of mentoring and the kinds of one-on-one coaching opportunities that you get in those types of settings. This is another one that gets us into this sort of example of what can happen when the punishment is something less than termination. This is Wayne Pacell, the CEO of the Humane Society of the United States, who was recently the subject of accusations of sexual harassment. And again, as happens with so many of these MeToo cases, it ends up being something that's covered in the popular press. In this case, several former employees and at least one current employee had complained that the CEO had behaved inappropriately toward them in incidents going back to 2005. The Humane Society hired an outside law firm which did a thorough investigation and found, among other things, a perception that certain women owed their career success to romantic relationships with the chief executive. The allegations ranged from forcing a woman to work late or salsa dancing and other kinds of things. There was a 7-hour meeting of the board at the end of which they decided to retain him. In response to that, 7 board members immediately resigned and did so with many public statements. Major organizations then said, I'm not going to give you any more money, and within days the CEO had himself resigned. I think that just happened earlier this week. So again, even when you try to sort of tailor the response to the severity of the conduct, sometimes even that comes back against you. So with all this in mind, what are the opportunities going forward? And I think what we're concluding is that your policies need to be updated and realistic. They need to be something that people really believe in and believe will be followed and responded to. Your training needs to be well done and relevant, and you need to have leadership engagement and meaningful statements and actions from the top. To make that training meaningful and engaging, addressing the fear factor head on. We know this is scary for people. We know there's a lot of uncharted water here. Let's talk about it and work that out. Allow for discussion so that people don't feel like there are certain points of view or questions that can't be asked. Make that a safe space for that conversation. Customize it to your specific work environment and openly address and discuss the backlash risks that might be there. We also want to make sure that if you do get reports of harassment, that you're set to respond to those swiftly and effectively. Sometimes, again, you're going to need to use an outside investigator to avoid any sort of conflicts of interest or anything like that. That's particularly true if the investigation is about a high-level person or executive in your organization. That can make that more difficult. So consider using an outside investigator. Give some careful consideration to privilege issues. Again, I think the normal thought is, hey, if I have in-house counsel and I can make this a privileged investigation, of course I'm going to want to do that. And in many cases, that's in fact true, but not always. And don't protect toxic workers. And that may be the single hardest item because people looking, again, at the short term, but let's think about this for a minute. I mean, Fox News has prospered despite the departure of their biggest, revenue generator, who was Bill O'Reilly. The same thing is true at the Today Show with Matt Lauer. We saw the stock price go up today for Wynn. So it's not always necessarily true that you end up worse off financially for dealing with those kinds of issues. So we've got just a couple minutes left, and I know that we have some questions, and I'm going to try to see if I can bring one of them up. Is this how I do this? Do I click here? Okay. So a question comes from someone who's listening who says, Brian asked the question, how can you square something like an anonymous tip line with an investigation? Can allegations hold without a name? That's a great question, and we've certainly dealt with that many times. So you have the person who reports anonymously. How do you investigate anonymous allegations? If the allegation, identifies an alleged harasser or policy violator, that allows you to start the investigation. If the report gives you truly nothing on which to go, then you can't really do an investigation. But most of the time, the anonymous allegation does come with some information that allows you to start a process. And the sort of related question is, what about the employee that comes to you and says, hey, I want to tell you about this, but please don't do anything. Or please promise me 100% confidentiality. And that is really not a promise you can give.
In most anonymous tips, even if they give you just the bare bones, they say, hey, I work in this division and the environment is toxic because people say things about sex, about women. That's a thing you can go to and observe. So even a bare bones allegation like that, you can do something with that.
Right. I think sometimes there's a concern that the anonymous complainer is their own version of the toxic worker, that they have nefarious objectives in mind and not really trying to address real harassment. And that's certainly a possibility, which why I say I think you need to do as an objective an investigation as possible. But I don't think the fact of anonymity can let you ignore the complaint in its entirety. But it's a great question because it's one that certainly comes up a lot. And then we have another question about how do you determine whether a training program is a good program and bring it in and use it at your workplace? That's another really good question. I think what I would do is take a look at training programs that are offered to you or that your consultants or outside counsel or whoever it may be are developing, and see whether you think it resembles in substance and caliber what kind of training you want. In other words, each work environment is going to be a little bit different. I can't really give you a checklist for what makes for good training. I would say that the basic components are that it tracks your specific policies, your specific culture, the specific ways in which your employees work. So I'll give you an example. I do a lot of work for, we do a lot of work for retailers. I also do a lot of work for schools. The training program that I would use in a school is very different than the training program I would use for a retailer, where the retailer has warehouse operations, they have store operations, and the work environments are very different among those. So it's a longer conversation about what the components of those training programs ought to look like, but we know what they should not look like, which is they should not be over-the-top cartoonish examples, and they should not be focused on fear, and they probably should focus less on the don'ts than the do's. So here's a positive way to have a good workplace culture, and should focus more on culture than necessarily the law. I know a lot of that is a little squishy, but those are the kinds of things that we're seeing in terms of good training programs. And we'll take one more. We have a question: how do you assess the need for the severity of the corrective action? Another great question. The legal test is steps reasonably calculated to keep the behavior from reoccurring. Now that's a little bit different than the current public test, which is demonstrating publicly that I really don't have any tolerance for this. But the legal test is, I look at the severity of the behavior and I look at the sort of surrounding circumstances. Does this appear to be a one-off kind of problem? Is this someone who's amenable to coaching? Or is the behavior so severe and the demonstration of a lack of self-awareness such that I'm not going to be able to coach or counsel this person and their employment is going to have to end? So again, I think we would have said, we used that Hillary Clinton example earlier, I think 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, we would have said in that case, boy, that seems like an appropriate sanction. You're going to dock his pay and send him for coaching and counseling. and then monitor to see that the behavior is consistent with your company policies and values. Today, I just think from a PR perspective, a lot of companies are going to be afraid of being caught in the kind of crosshair that we saw with the Humane Society and may lean a little more toward a stronger adverse consequence for someone who's found to have engaged in that behavior. So, yes, the severity of the punishment should fit the severity of the crime, but in the current environment, I would think that you're probably going to err on the side of more severe sanctions, if for no other reason than that the public aspect of this is much more than it was, say, a relatively short time ago. All right. Well, I see we've reached the end of our time. We've gone over a little bit. I really want to thank you all for joining us today, and certainly you have our contact information there. If you have follow-up questions, you should feel free to email us, and we will do our best to respond to those. And with that, we wish you good afternoon, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you all.